I'm reviewing this. It's a book called Roadside Picnic by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. The Strugatsky brothers were these Russian science fiction authors who almost always collaborated in their stories together. Roadside Picnic is their most famous story, and it was originally published in the early 70s across 4 magazine installations. But when the brothers tried to publish these installations together as a novel, the Soviet censors would not have it. So the book ended up in publication limbo for 8 years, and when it finally did come out, it had been absolutely mangled by Soviet sensibilities and censorship. It wasn't until 2011 that Olena Bormashenko came out with an uncensored translation in English. Now, I had been wanting to find this book for years, ever since I saw Andrei Tarkovsky's adaptation called Stalker, and wouldn't you know it, I was just going past a mini-free library and I found the exact translation I was looking for sitting right there, so I eagerly grabbed it, and I had a pretty interesting time reading it. The story is about the black market which pops up after aliens visit Earth in several random locations and leave in their wake these barren, dangerous zones where there's a lot of these artifacts with strange, mysterious powers. The governments of the world wall off these zones wherever they happen to be. So in the case of this story, we're following a zone on the edge of a small town called Harmont. These people called stalkers will sneak in and try to recover whatever artifacts they can to sell on the black market. So Roadside Picnic follows a stalker named Red, who is this gruff, alcoholic young man, and we follow him and his criminal dealings and their effects on himself and the people around him. You can really notice the serialized format of this story as you're going through it. The book only has 4 chapters, but they're each pretty long, and they jump ahead in time between each chapter, sometimes by years. They almost feel like they're self-contained stories, although they do build on each other in the way that a conventional novel would. Red has one foot in both the official and criminal enterprises associated with the zone. By day, he works with an official research facility who studies the zone, and then he moonlights as a stalker to make extra money and feed his alcohol addiction. Early on, he convinces a couple scientists to go with him into the zone in order to retrieve an object that he knows is very valuable to their research, and wouldn't you know it, something goes wrong. This isn't the kind of science fiction story that's fast-paced with action set pieces or scary creatures. Instead, Roadside Picnic focuses on building this lingering sense of dread and mystery within the zone, while also working on this bleak and aimless society outside of the zone. The zone in this story partially encircles what used to be a residential neighborhood, which is completely abandoned now. You hear about how everybody had to evacuate in a hurry, and a lot of people completely vanished after the aliens arrived. Red also talks about these things called bug traps in the zones, which are these unseen things where if you walk into them, you could be killed. So you have to keep your eyes peeled for any object that might have been moved out of place since you were last there in order to avoid them. It's really cool and creepy. As the story develops, you learn a lot more about the criminal enterprises surrounding the zone. You also get this increasing sense of disillusionment from Red about his role in things. There's this pattern of people viewing each other as disposable and exploiting one another for simple personal gain. The characters are made to feel small and meaningless in the face of something they don't understand. This is captured in the title, which comes up when the characters are speculating, why did the aliens visit us? And somebody suggests that maybe instead of trying to deliver some grand message to humanity, the aliens were just stopping on Earth on their way to somewhere else, like a roadside picnic. And using that analogy, that would mean the humans are like the ants who are fighting over the scraps that the aliens left behind. This nihilistic tone is also captured in the material conditions of the town that this is set in. The stalkers, a lot of them view the zone as a means of escape, and yet they often spend their earnings on vices, so they're also caught in this cycle of addiction and never really getting anywhere in terms of getting away from the zone and living a better life. As you enter the second chapter in this book, there's a pretty sizable shift in the approach to the story. It set me up to realize that there's going to be a lot of shifting in style and approach throughout this book. The problem, though, is that some of these shifts are a little bit too big to swallow. Not only do you jump ahead in time with every chapter, but the first chapter is written in this gritty first-person perspective from Red, which I was pretty into, and from the rest of the book on, the first-person perspective is completely abandoned in favor of this third-person limited, which I found a lot less engaging for a story like this. But the worst issue that came out of this serialized format came with the third chapter, and keep in mind, each chapter in this story takes up roughly a quarter of the book, so it's not as if they're just small sections or anything. The third chapter inexplicably cuts away from Red's perspective entirely in favor of following his friend Richard, who is also a stalker. This chapter grinds the momentum to a screeching halt, and even though it has its interesting moments, I think they could have been delivered in a better way than this. And then in the fourth chapter, we cut back to Red, and we barely hear about Richard anymore. So this really gave me the impression that the authors were uncertain about where they were going, and they were really feeling their way forward here. Of course, I understand that serialized formats often play up this looser story structure, but I've seen much better examples of this that ended up feeling a lot more cohesive and unified. Catcher in the Rye being a perfect example of this. The prose in this book is pretty hit and miss, clunky phrasing, rough around the edges, but I was willing to forgive the rougher aspects because I was pretty invested in Red's gritty first-person perspective. So when the first-person perspective gets completely abandoned, I really missed it when it was gone. It gave this book a very unique voice, so I really couldn't understand why the authors got rid of it. They also have these conveyance issues sometimes where it's not clear what they're getting at first. For example, we hear about how the zone causes birth defects, and eventually we meet one of the stalker's children, and he calls her Monkey, and she has this thick golden hair. I figured he's just calling her a cute nickname, and the hair is like the hair on her head. But no, it turns out she's a full monkey child with fur and paws and everything. But she talks normal and acts normal, and the character goes out of his way to help her make friends, so you wonder why on earth is he calling her Monkey instead of a proper name? Isn't that a little insulting? It's a very strange choice. At other times, the book goes too far in the other direction, telling when it should be showing. There are these really interesting aspects of the zone that it would have been really gripping to see unfold in an organic way, but instead we're just told about them in exposition dumps after the fact. Maybe that was the author's way of showing how normalized a lot of this stuff has become for the people in this town, but I still felt like it was a bit of an odd choice that was contrary to the author's aims. But like I said, there are still a lot of evocative descriptions and imagery throughout the book, like Red attaching himself like a leech to his flask to illustrate his need for alcohol, or descriptions within the zone that made even the most mundane things seem dangerous and otherworldly. But I don't want to give the impression that Roadside Picnic is completely disjointed or aimless. Each installment builds upon the previous one in a pretty meaningful way, and there's also some pretty interesting thematic stuff going on under the surface. Of course, you've got Red's man versus self struggle, his addiction to the zone and alcohol, how he sees himself and society at large as trapped in this cycle, which of course can be a criticism of capitalism, but then you've also got this criticism of the Soviet Union with this running theme of isolationism and restrictions on freedom of movement. You've got allusions to industry and pollution and possibly radiation in an atomic world. And there's also this spiritual motif that almost paints the zone as if it's like some graveyard of the soul. There are, as you might expect, one or two pretty pedantic philosophical monologues in this book, but from older sci-fi, I kind of expected that going in, so it didn't bother me too much. Roadside Picnic saves its best for last. So if you're running into a bit of a wall on that third chapter, I urge you to push through it because this had the best climax that I have read all year so far. While I definitely would have preferred it if they'd given more development to the character that Red is with near the end, I know that I'm not going to be forgetting this ending anytime soon. It's really immersive and tense and agonizing to read at times, and it takes the story from this strange, unsettling place to borderline horror. I was just left pretty breathless by the end of it. So this book definitely has strengths, but it also has some major weaknesses, specifically with the writing and the pacing and some of the odd choices I mentioned earlier. But overall, I would give it a 7 out of 10. If you're interested in more understated, thoughtful science fiction as opposed to the more flashy kind, then I would definitely give this book a shot. It's pretty short and definitely memorable in a lot of ways. I'd love to hear from you if you've read this book, if you have any interpretations of your own, and if you've read any sci-fi that you'd like to recommend me. I'd love to hear from you because sci-fi is a genre I often have a hard time with, so it's always a big deal for me when I find one that clicks with me despite a few flaws. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Roadside Picnic. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time.